In the rugged heart of Scandinavia, where the cold wind from the Baltic Sea tears the clouds apart and the forests stretch endlessly under a veil of mist, the year was 1560. Sweden stood at a turning point in its history. The death of King Gustav Vasa, the man who had forged Swedish independence, left the throne to his brilliant yet unpredictable son, Eric XIV. From his earliest years, Eric had been unlike any other royal heir. He possessed a mind both sharp and restless, a curiosity that could not be satisfied by courtly games or the predictable rituals of noble life. Educated to a degree unusual even for a prince, Eric spoke Latin, German, and French with ease. He could read the dusty chronicles of ancient Rome and medieval Europe, and he spent hours studying the intricate patterns of the stars. He was as comfortable discussing military strategy as he was reciting poetry or debating theology. Eric's fascination with astrology was no mere pastime. He believed the heavens themselves whispered to him the secrets of his destiny. On quiet nights, he would gaze through the narrow windows of the royal chambers, his eyes tracing constellations as if searching for hidden omens, divine signs of what his reign was meant to become. When he ascended the throne, many believed Sweden was entering a golden age. Eric threw himself into reform, strengthening the state, tightening laws, seeking to expand trade, and building alliances across Europe. He could charm a peasant as easily as he could win over a foreign diplomat, his charisma a tool as sharp as any sword. But power, as always, came with shadows. Behind the gilded doors of the court, noble families whispered in corridors, their ambitions a silent threat to the young king's authority. Eric began to sense, or perhaps imagine, that not all smiles were sincere, that too many eyes lingered on him for too long. The air in the palace seemed heavy with unspoken plots. At first, it was only a flicker of unease, an instinct that perhaps not everyone in his court wished him well. Yet, as the months passed, this flicker grew into a spark, and that spark began to smolder in his mind. He would lie awake long after the candles had burned down, listening to the creak of the wooden beams, convinced that even the walls themselves might be listening. In those quiet, sleepless hours, the seeds of suspicion were sown, seeds that would one day grow into a consuming fire. Eric XIV's reign had begun in brilliance, but already the shadow of paranoia was stretching across his path, and it would not be long before it swallowed him whole. The early years of Eric XIV's reign had been filled with ambition and promise, but now something in the air had changed. The once vibrant king, whose speeches had inspired loyalty and pride, began to look over his shoulder during feasts. His laughter was less frequent, his eyes sharper, searching, always searching. At first, the court dismissed it as the natural caution of a ruler. After all, Europe was a chessboard of betrayal, and kings often fell not by the sword of an enemy, but by the dagger of a supposed friend. But for Eric, suspicion was no longer a political necessity. It was becoming an obsession. He began keeping lists, names of noblemen, ministers, even distant relatives, each marked with cryptic notes about their possible treachery. Small disagreements at council meetings were interpreted as secret rebellion. A careless glance between two advisors could be read as a sign of conspiracy. Those who had once been closest to him now felt the chill of his mistrust. Old friends avoided his gaze. Courtiers spoke in careful, measured tones, and rumors began to circulate that the king sometimes held late-night interrogations in locked chambers, demanding to know who was plotting against him. The catalyst came in the form of the powerful Sture family, one of Sweden's most influential noble houses. Whispers reached the king's ears that they were questioning his judgment, perhaps even his right to rule. To an already suspicious mind, this was no mere gossip. This was confirmation. The voices in his head, whether imagined or born from real fear, told him the threat was real and growing. Eric's behavior grew erratic. One moment, he would shower a courtier with praise and gifts. The next, he would accuse them of treason in front of the entire royal assembly. Foreign ambassadors, unsettled by the king's sudden outbursts, began sending concerned reports home, describing him as brilliant but unstable. The tension reached its breaking point in 1567. Eric summoned members of the Stuart family to his presence, ostensibly for reconciliation. They entered the room expecting diplomacy, but found instead the wild eyes of a king no longer entirely in control of his mind. What followed would stain Eric XIV's name forever, a violent outburst that transformed fear into horror and suspicion into bloodshed. The spring of 1567 in Sweden was unusually warm, but inside the royal castle, the air was thick with unease. In a great hall meant for diplomacy and council, the tension was a living thing coiling around the stone walls, feeding on the silence. The members of the Stuart family stood before King Eric XIV. They were dressed formally, but their eyes betrayed caution. These were men who had served Sweden with honor, who had once laughed and feasted with the king. Now, they faced a ruler whose mind teetered on the edge. At first, Eric spoke with a veneer of civility. He asked questions about loyalty, about oaths to the crown, about whispers in the corridors. The Stuarts answered with steady voices, denying treachery, appealing to reason. But reason had long since abandoned the throne. Without warning, the king's composure shattered. In a sudden, terrifying rage, Eric accused them outright of plotting to overthrow him. The court froze, no one dared speak. The king's words became a torrent, each syllable sharper than a blade. His paranoia had reached a fever pitch. Then came the breaking point. Eric's hand went to his weapon. Steel flashed in the flickering torchlight. He struck, not with the deliberation of a ruler dispensing justice, but with the uncontrolled fury of a man consumed by fear. The room erupted into chaos. Guards, confused and terrified, joined in the violence. Cries of pain echoed through the hall as the Stuart men fell, one by one. By the time the blood stopped flowing, the stone floor was slick, and the once proud Stuart family lay lifeless before the throne. The courtiers stood in shock, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The king, their king, had slaughtered his own nobles with his own hands. In the days that followed, word of the massacre spread like wildfire. The people of Sweden spoke of their ruler not as a just king, but as a madman. Even those who had once defended Eric now whispered of his instability, his dangerous mind. It was the beginning of the end. The murders would haunt Eric XIV for the rest of his reign, fueling a spiral that would see him dethroned, imprisoned, and remembered in history not for his ambitions, but for the darkness that consumed him. A king who had dreamed of glory now forever bound to the shadow of madness.